Lucas, Caleb, and Wyatt were a brotherhood forged in grease and gasoline. While other siblings argued over sports or politics, these three communicated through the roar of diesel engines and the screech of rusted bolts. Their YouTube channel had become a digital campfire for gearheads, documenting their mission to save heavy iron from the scrap heap. But this project was different. It was their white whale. Deep within the dense rain-soaked timberlands of the Pacific Northwest sat a 1940s Caterpillar D8, a 20-ton giant that had been swallowed by the forest. The locals whispered about the Iron Ghost, a machine abandoned overnight when the logging camp went bankrupt in 1974. The brothers had emptied their collective savings to buy the land rights, driven by the singular obsession of hearing the D8's massive heartbeat again. The expedition to the site was a logistical nightmare. The logging roads were gone, washed away by decades of rain. The trio had to hike in, looking like pack mules, carrying over 100 pounds of batteries, solvents, and heavy-duty tools between them. Wyatt, the youngest and fittest, carried the heavy breaker bars, while Lucas and Caleb lugged the fluids and camera gear. When the dark shape of the Dozer finally loomed out of the mist, they stopped in their tracks. It was magnificent and terrifying. A monolith of faded yellow industrial paint and consuming rust, the machine was sinking into the earth, with ferns growing through the tracks and moss carpeting the operator's seat. The forest was silent, watching them. They set up a base camp around the machine, clearing the brush to get access to the engine bay. The first target was the pony motor. Unlike modern bulldozers, this ancient beast didn't start with a key turn. It required a smaller, two-cylinder gasoline engine, the pony, to be hand-cranked to life first. The pony's job was to warm up and spin the massive main diesel engine. If the pony was dead, the D8 was just a 20-ton paperweight. Lucas climbed up onto the slick tracks to inspect the unit, while Caleb and Wyatt organized the tools on the muddy ground. Lucas pulled the pony's dipstick. It was bone dry. Not just low, but clean. It was the first sign that something was wrong. Engines abandoned in a panic usually contain fluids. A dry engine suggested deliberate preparation. Hey everyone! We are taking a quick second to ask for your help on this massive adventure. We are incredibly close to hitting 10,000 subscribers, and we want you on the crew when we cross that milestone. If you love seeing heavy metal brought back from the dead, please smash that like button and subscribe right now. It helps us fund these crazy rescues. Also, we have enabled super thanks below if you want to support the grease, gears, and gasoline directly. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are watching from. We love seeing how far the Iron Ghost story travels. Now, let's get back to the engine. With the sun filtering through the canopy, the brothers decided to test the engine's rotation. Caleb handed up a can of penetrating oil, soaking the cylinders, while Wyatt positioned the work light to cut through the gloom of the engine bay. Lucas fitted the heavy iron hand crank into the pony motor's slot. He braced his feet against the rusted hood and pushed. He expected the gritty resistance of a seized piston, the friction of 50 years of rust. Instead, he hit a solid wall. A distinct metallic clunk resonated through the machine's frame. It wasn't rust, it was a mechanical blockage. They exchanged worried glances. A hard stop meant something was broken or lodged inside. They shifted gears immediately, moving from restoration to surgery. The three brothers worked in a synchronized rhythm, Wyatt loosening the rusted bolts with the breaker bar, Caleb organizing the hardware, and Lucas preparing the hoist. They had to remove the head of the pony motor. The bolts screamed as they were forced to turn for the first time in 5 decades. After an hour of sweating and cursing, the final bolt snapped free. Lucas and Caleb lifted the heavy cast-iron head off the engine block, while Wyatt shone the light directly into the open cylinders. They leaned in, expecting to see a shattered piston rod or a rat's nest. Instead, the beam of light revealed something impossible. The cylinder walls were pristine, heavily coated in a thick, vintage grease that had preserved them perfectly. But sitting on top of the number 1 piston, physically preventing the engine from turning over, was a foreign object. It was a thick, wax-sealed canvas pouch, jammed into the cylinder bore. It had been placed there intentionally. The spark plug had been removed, the package inserted, and the plug replaced to seal it in. Wyatt reached in with his gloved hand and carefully extracted the pouch. It was heavy, dense, and smelled of old chemical preservatives. The brothers stood in a circle on the muddy forest floor, the engine forgotten for a moment. Lucas took a pocket knife and sliced the wax seal. Inside the canvas lay a heavy, brass skeleton key with a complex, three-pronged bit and a folded sheet of onion skin paper. Caleb unfolded the fragile paper. It was a hand-drawn topographical map of the very valley they were standing in, dated October 1974. A red ink trail led from their current location to a spot 300 yards north, marked the Devil's Anvil. The realization hit them simultaneously. The D8 hadn't broken down. It had been turned into a safe. The pony motor was sabotaged to ensure no one could start the machine and move it, and the cylinder was used as a lockbox that only a mechanic would ever find. The brothers looked toward the north, where the dense trees grew darker as twilight approached. They had come to fix a bulldozer, but the machine had just given them a quest. With the light fading, they grabbed their flashlights and the mysterious key, leaving the tools behind. The engine could wait. The map demanded answers. The forest had transformed with the setting sun. What was a green, mossy timberland during the day became a claustrophobic wall of shadows as night fell. Lucas, Caleb, and Wyatt clicked on their high-lumen flashlights, the beams cutting through the mist that was beginning to rise from the damp forest floor. They left the massive, silent silhouette of the D8 bulldozer behind them, its yellow paint now looking gray in the gloom. The map they had pulled from the cylinder was their only guide, the onion skin paper crinkling in Caleb's hands as he navigated over fallen cedar logs and through thick patches of Devil's Club. The red line on the map was short, but the terrain was unforgiving. They weren't hiking. They were climbing over the debris of a forest that had been left to rot for half a century. After 20 minutes of struggling through the underbrush, the beam of Wyatt's flashlight hit stone. Looming out of the darkness was a massive, jagged rock formation that looked out of place among the towering fir trees. It was the Devil's Anvil, a slab of granite shaped by ancient glacial forces, flat on top and tapering at the base. It matched the drawing on the map perfectly. The brothers spread out, scanning the base of the rock for anything man-made. The map indicated a spot on the northern face, tucked beneath a heavy overhang of stone. Lucas found it first. He called out, waving his light. Hidden behind a thick curtain of decades-old ivy and accumulated soil was a rusted steel plate, bolted directly into the granite. It wasn't a natural fissure. It was an industrial access door, likely stolen from the logging camp's heavy equipment supply and repurposed here. In the center of the plate was a single, heavy brass keyhole protected by a sliding cover. Lucas stepped forward, the brass key from the pony motor warm in his hand. The moment was tense. If the key didn't fit, the trail ended here. He slid the key into the mechanism. It felt gritty, but as he applied torque, the internal tumblers clicked, a loud mechanical sound that echoed in the quiet woods. With a heavy groan of metal on metal, the locking bolts retracted. Caleb and Wyatt grabbed the edges of the steel plate and pulled. The hinges were stiff, fighting against 50 years of oxidation, but with a collective heave, the door swung open. The air that escaped the small cavity was stale and smelled of oil and old paper. The brothers shone their lights inside. It wasn't a pirate's treasure chest of gold coins. It was something far more valuable to three mechanics trying to start a dead machine. The small, rock-hewn chamber was lined with wood and contained a heavy, greased crate and a leather-bound ledger. They dragged the crate out onto the forest floor and pried the lid open. Inside, nestled in oil-soaked rags, were two specific, heavy mechanical components, a Bosch magneto and a diesel fuel injection pump. The brothers immediately understood the significance. These were the vital organs of the D8. The pony motor hadn't just been jammed. Its spark source, the magneto, had been removed entirely. and the main diesel engine had been neutered by the removal of its injection pump. The previous owner hadn't just parked the machine, they had surgically disabled it, removing the parts that were impossible to replace in the wilderness, and hidden them here. The Dozer was never meant to be started by anyone who didn't have this specific cache. Wyatt opened the leather ledger. The pages were brittle, filled with the frantic handwritten scrawl of the camp's foreman, a man named Elias Thorne. The entries dated back to late 1974. As Wyatt read the faded ink under the flashlight beam, the story of the Iron Ghost began to unravel. The logging company hadn't just gone bankrupt. The final entry described a labor riot. The workers, unpaid for 3 months, had turned violent. Thorne, fearing the company's payroll, a cash shipment intended to settle the debts and close the camp, would be looted by the mob, had taken drastic action. The ledger revealed that Thorne had used the D8 to bury the company's strongbox, containing the payroll and liquid assets, deep beneath the earth. But he didn't just bury it anywhere. The entry read, "Buried the box at marker 4. Parked the D8 directly over the dig site. Disabled the pony. Hid the mag and pump at the anvil. If they can't move the Dozer, they can't get to the money." The brothers looked at each other in the harsh light of the torches. The massive bulldozer they had just bought wasn't just an abandoned piece of equipment. It was the lock on a vault. The treasure, the payroll from 1974, was buried directly underneath the machine's 20 tons of steel. The only way to access the money was to move the machine. And the only way to move the machine was to reinstall the parts they had just found and resurrect the engine. The sabotage was a security measure. Thorne had likely fled, intending to return when the heat died down, but he never made it back. The stakes had just skyrocketed. They were no longer just restoring a vintage tractor for a YouTube video. They were sitting on top of a 50-year-old cold case involving a missing fortune. The D8 was the guardian. Lucas carefully wrapped the magneto and the injection pump back in the rags. These parts were now worth their weight in gold. If they could get them back to the Dozer and install them, they had a chance to wake the giant. But the forest felt different now. The silence felt heavy, as if the history of the riot and the desperate foreman was closing in on them. They packed the crate and the ledger, hoisting the heavy components onto their shoulders. The hike back to the bulldozer was fueled by adrenaline. Every shadow looked like a disgruntled logger from 1974. When they finally broke through the trees and saw the yellow shape of the D8 reflecting their lights, it looked different. It wasn't just a rust bucket anymore. It was a fortress. They climbed onto the tracks, placing the precious parts on the operator's seat. They had the heart and the blood of the machine. Now, they had to perform the transplant. But the D8 had sat for 50 years. Installing the parts was one thing, getting the seized pistons to fire was another. And if the ledger was true, the moment that machine moved, the ground beneath it would reveal the final secret. They decided to camp on the machine that night, taking turns keeping watch. The Iron Ghost was about to be challenged. Dawn broke over the Pacific Northwest timberlands, piercing the mist with shafts of pale, gray light. The forest was waking up, but on the rusting carcass of the Caterpillar D8, the three brothers had been awake for hours. The previous night's discovery, the map, the ledger, and the hidden engine components, had charged the air with a kinetic energy that caffeine alone couldn't provide. They weren't just mechanics anymore. They were tomb raiders, and the massive yellow bulldozer was the stone sealing the entrance. The plan for the day was audacious but simple. Reinstall the stolen organs, resurrect the machine, and move the 20-ton beast to reveal the buried fortune of the 1974 payroll. The first surgical procedure focused on the pony motor. Lucas, the most experienced with vintage ignition systems, treated the recovered Bosch magneto like a Faberge egg. He sat cross-legged on the muddy track, cleaning the contact points with a diamond file and checking the gap with a feeler gauge. The magneto was the spark of life. Without it, the pony was dead, and without the pony, the main diesel was immovable. Caleb and Wyatt worked on the fuel system. The original tank was filled with a sludge that resembled tar, so they bypassed it entirely, rigging a clean 5-gallon jerrycan of high-octane gasoline directly to the carburetor using fresh rubber hoses. With the magneto bolted in place and timed to the flywheel, the moment of truth arrived. The pony motor, a 2-cylinder gas engine sitting atop the massive diesel block, had to be hand-cranked. Wyatt, the youngest and strongest, took the position. He gripped the iron crank handle, feeling the compression. He gave a nod to Lucas, who stood ready with the choke linkage. Wyatt pulled. The engine wheezed, sucking in air for the first time in 50 years. He pulled again. And again. The physical exertion was immense, the sound of the metal turning over echoing flatly in the damp woods. On the 10th pull, a single loud pop rang out like a gunshot, sending a puff of blue smoke out of the exhaust stack. The brothers froze, looking at each other. It wanted to run. Wyatt gritted his teeth and heaved on the crank with everything he had. The engine sputtered, coughed violently, and then, with a roar that sent birds scattering from the trees, the pony motor roared to life. It settled into a high-pitched, screaming idle, blowing decades of rust, mouse nests, and acorns out of the exhaust pipe in a chaotic shower of debris. The noise was jarring in the silent forest, an industrial scream that signaled the return of the iron ghost. Lucas rushed to adjust the mixture, smoothing out the idle. They high-fived, shouting over the noise, but they knew this was only the first step. The pony motor needed to run for at least 30 minutes to circulate warm coolant and oil through the main diesel block. The massive 14-liter diesel engine was a sleeping giant, cold and stiff. While the pony screamed, generating heat, the brothers turned their attention to the second recovered artifact, the diesel injection pump. This was the heart of the beast. Caleb carefully cleaned the mounting surface on the side of the main engine. The pump was heavy, a complex assembly of plungers and springs. If this wasn't timed perfectly to the camshaft, the engine would either not start, or worse, run away uncontrollably and destroy itself. They lowered it into place, the gears meshing with a satisfying clunk. After 40 minutes, the heat radiating from the main engine block could be felt through their coveralls. The iron was warm. It was time. This was the complex dance of the D8 starting procedure. Lucas climbed into the operator's seat, surrounded by levers that looked like medieval torture devices. He engaged the clutch on the pony motor, which began to spin the massive flywheel of the main diesel engine. The sound changed deeper, rhythmic chug-chug-chug as the pony fought to turn the massive pistons against the friction of 50 years. The oil pressure gauge on the dash flickered and then climbed. The blood was flowing. Lucas looked at his brothers on the ground. They were clear. He reached for the compression release lever, flipping it to the run position, and then pulled the throttle back. The pony motor groaned under the load, pushing the diesel engine faster and faster. Then it happened. The rhythm broke. A deep, thunderous boom shook the ground, followed by another. The exhaust stack, a simple straight pipe pointing at the sky, erupted. A column of thick, black soot shot 20 feet into the air, blotting out the morning sun. The main diesel engine caught. The sound was not a scream like the pony, but a slow, earth-shaking hammer beat. Thump, thump, thump. The ground beneath their boots literally vibrated. The D8 was running. The vibration was so intense that dried mud flaked off the tracks and fell to the forest floor. The smell of unburnt diesel and ancient dust filled the clearing. The iron ghost had awakened, and it sounded angry. Lucas kept a steady hand on the throttle, watching the gauges. The temperature was rising. Oil pressure was good. The sheer violence of the machine was intimidating. It felt less like a vehicle and more like a captured natural force. But now came the critical test. The engine ran, but could the machine move? The tracks were rusted, the clutches likely stuck, and the machine had sunk 2 feet into the mud over the last half-century. Wyatt signaled from the ground, pointing to the tracks. They needed to see if the drive sprockets would turn. Lucas pushed the clutch lever forward and engaged first gear. He revved the engine, the black smoke turning to a gray heat haze. He released the clutch. The engine groaned, the RPMs dropping as it took the load. The massive steel sprocket teeth bit into the rusted track links. There was a screech of tearing metal, a sound like a banshee, as the rust bonds shattered. The machine shuddered violently, lurching forward 3 inches before slamming back down. It moved. But as the machine settled back into its ruts, something shifted beneath it. The vibration of the 20-ton engine running for the first time in decades had destabilized the ground. Caleb, standing near the front blade, shouted and pointed down. A small sinkhole was beginning to form near the front idler wheel. The earth, disturbed by the vibration and the weight, was collapsing into a void beneath the dozer. The ledger was right. There was a hollow space beneath them. But the collapse wasn't revealing a treasure chest, it was destabilizing the machine. The D8 began to tilt dangerously to the left, the heavy engine weighing it down, sliding toward the depression. They had to move it now, or the iron ghost would tip over and crush the very secret it was guarding. Lucas grabbed the controls, eyes wide, preparing to fight the machine for every inch of ground. The situation in the clearing had escalated from a mechanical triumph to a survival crisis in a matter of seconds. The 20-ton Caterpillar D8 was no longer sitting flat. It was listing aggressively to the left, the massive steel tracks sliding sideways into the collapsing earth. Lucas, strapped into the operator's seat, felt the center of gravity shifting past the point of no return. If the machine rolled, it would crush him and bury the excavation site under an immovable mountain of iron. He didn't have time to think. He acted on instinct, his hands flying across the levers. He needed traction, and he needed it immediately. He slammed the hydraulic control lever forward, dropping the massive front blade. The hydraulic cylinders, sluggish with cold fluid, hissed and groaned, but the blade descended, biting deep into the soft soil of the forest floor. It acted as an emergency anchor, stabilizing the tilt just enough to stop the roll. With the blade digging in, Lucas roared the engine to full throttle. The exhaust stack erupted like a volcano, spewing thick black smoke that darkened the sky. He engaged the right steering clutch and hauled back on the left brake, trying to force the machine to pivot out of the sinkhole. The tracks churned, throwing rooster tails of mud and rotten wood high into the air. For a heart-stopping moment, the machine just dug deeper, the engine bogging down under the immense load. Then, the steel grousers found purchase on a buried root system. The D8 shuddered violently, the nose lifting as it clawed its way up the embankment. With a screech of tearing metal and the roar of the diesel engine at redline, the iron ghost surged forward, dragging its belly over the edge of the pit and slamming down onto solid ground 3 meters away. Lucas cut the throttle immediately, the engine settling back into its rhythmic, thumping idle. He sat there for a moment, gripping the controls, his chest heaving. Caleb and Wyatt, who had scrambled to safety, ran back toward the machine, giving thumbs-up signals through the cloud of dust and exhaust. They were safe. The machine was safe. And now the hole was open. The brothers killed the engine. The silence that rushed back into the forest was deafening, ringing in their ears. They walked to the edge of the depression the dozer had created. The vibration and weight had collapsed the roof of what appeared to be an old, timber-lined root cellar or storage bunker, hidden perfectly beneath the topsoil. Looking down into the dark, earthy void, the beam of their flashlights caught the reflection of wet metal. It wasn't a loose pile of money. It was a large industrial-grade steel strongbox, roughly the size of a modern chest freezer, heavily rusted but intact. It had been sitting there, waiting in the dark, since 1974. Getting it out required the machine one last time. They rigged a heavy logging chain around the strongbox, hooking the other end to the D8's rear drawbar. Lucas fired up the pony motor, then the main engine, and gently eased the machine forward in first gear. The D8 didn't even struggle. The torque was so immense that the steel box was dragged up the muddy slope and onto the flat ground as if it were a cardboard box. They shut the machine down for good. Now, it was just the 3 of them, the forest and the box. The lock on the strongbox was a heavy, rotary combination dial, fused solid by rust. No key or code would open it now. Wyatt retrieved the oxyacetylene torch kit from their tool cache. He lit the torch, adjusting the flame until it hissed with a sharp, blue intensity. The smell of burning steel mixed with the pine air as he began to cut the heavy hinges. It took 20 minutes of careful work, the molten metal dripping onto the moss, before the lid was finally free. The metal was still hot, so they used pry bars to leverage the heavy steel lid up and over. The contents were heartbreaking at first glance. The top layer was indeed the payroll. Stacks of bundled 1974 U.S. banknotes filled the upper trays. But the box had not been watertight. Groundwater had seeped in over the decades. The paper money was a sodden, pulpy mass of green and gray rot. The bands were still visible, marking thousands of dollars, but the currency itself was destroyed, fused into bricks of mold. The fortune Elias Thorne had died protecting seemed to be nothing but compost. Caleb let out a sigh of frustration, poking a disintegrated stack of $20 bills with his gloved finger. But the ledger had mentioned liquid assets. Lucas noticed that the cash trays were removable. He grabbed the handles of the top tray, which was heavy with waterlogged paper, and heaved it out, tossing it onto the grass. Beneath the false bottom of the cash compartment there was a second layer, separated by a sheet of oilcloth that had survived the moisture. He peeled back the cloth. The brothers stopped breathing. Lining the bottom of the strongbox were not paper bills, but heavy, canvas sacks stamped with the logo of a smelting assay office in Seattle. They were small but incredibly dense. Lucas reached in and untied the drawstring of the nearest sack. He poured the contents into his palm. It wasn't refined coins. It was raw, placer gold nuggets and rough-poured ingots. The gold was dull in the low light, but unmistakably heavy and yellow. The logging company hadn't just been cutting trees. The map, the secrecy, the riot, it all made sense. They had been running an illegal hydraulic mining operation on federal land, using the logging camp as a cover. The payroll was just the operational cash. The real wealth was the gold they were skimming from the land. Gold didn't rot. Gold didn't rust. It sat in the mud, perfectly preserved, waiting for someone to find it. They began to unload the sacks, counting them one by one. There were 12 sacks in total, plus 4 roughly poured bars that looked like they had been smelted in a campfire. The weight was staggering. They weren't looking at a few $1,000s. They were looking at kilograms of raw gold. The sheer value sitting on the muddy forest floor was hard to comprehend. They had spent their savings on a rusted tractor hoping to make a few YouTube videos, and they had unearthed a criminal fortune that had been buried for half a century. But as they sat there, surrounded by the gold and the rotting cash, Wyatt pulled one last item from the bottom of the box. It was a waterproof canister, sealed with wax. He popped the lid. Inside was a land deed and a notarized confession from the company owner, admitting to the illegal mining and assigning full liability to the foreman, Thorne, in a set-up frame job. The document was dated 2 days before the riot. Thorne hadn't stolen the money to keep it from the workers. He had stolen it to use as leverage and evidence to clear his name, but he never got the chance. The brothers held the truth of the 1974 riot in their hands. They had the gold, but they also had the proof that would rewrite the local history books. The adventure wasn't over. The legal battle to claim this salvage was just beginning. The hike out of the forest that evening was the longest of their lives. Lucas, Caleb, and Wyatt were no longer carrying tools or batteries. Their packs were weighed down by over 60 pounds of raw, placer gold and the heavy iron-bound confession of a dead man. They left the D8 Dozer behind, sitting silently next to the open pit, a yellow sentinel guarding the empty vault. The paranoia was palpable. Every snapping twig sounded like a footstep. Every shadow looked like a threat. They weren't just mechanics hiking home. They were carrying a life-changing fortune through the wilderness. When they finally reached their truck, collapsed into the seats, and locked the doors, the adrenaline crash was almost painful. They drove in silence, the backpack sitting on the center console like a loaded weapon. The next morning, the celebration was replaced by strategy. They knew they couldn't just walk into a pawn shop with sacks of raw gold nuggets stamped with a defunct 1970s mining logo. They needed legal protection. They contacted a specialized attorney dealing in recovered assets and maritime salvage law. The meeting was tense. The brothers laid out the map, the key, the confession letter, and finally, a single sample bar of the rough-poured gold. The lawyer's skepticism evaporated the moment the gold hit the mahogany table with a heavy thud. The legal process was a labyrinth. The rotten cash, technically the stolen payroll, was awash. It was destroyed and unclaimed by the long-dissolved insurance companies. However, the gold was a different story. The confession letter proved crucial. It established that the gold was the product of an illegal, unreported criminal enterprise run by the logging company owners, not the company's official assets. Since the company had been dissolved for decades and the owners were long dead with no heirs claiming criminal proceeds, the gold fell under a specific clause of treasure trove law. It was abandoned wealth with no legitimate owner. After 6 months of agonizing court proceedings, background checks, and federal review, the judgment came down. The state took a tax percentage, but the bulk of the find was awarded to the finders, Lucas, Caleb, and Wyatt. The appraisal of the gold was staggering. The raw nuggets were high purity, and the historical nature of the find added a premium to collectors. The total value of the Iron Ghost hoard was valued at $5.2 million USD. The brothers, who had scraped together their savings just to buy the rusted tractor, were now multimillionaires. But they didn't buy sports cars or mansions. They had a promise to keep. Their first significant expenditure was a heavy haul recovery operation. They hired a massive specialized forestry crane and a lowboy heavy haul truck. They returned to the forest, not as scavengers, but as rescuers. They built a proper road into the site and lifted the 1940s Caterpillar D8 out of the mud that had held it for 50 years. The machine was transported back to their shop, where it underwent a meticulous mechanical restoration. They decided not to paint it. They cleaned the rust, sealed the patina with clear coat, and left every scar, dent, and moss stain visible. It was a monument to its own history. The documents found in the box were donated to the state archives. The history of the 1974 logging riot was rewritten. Elias Thorne, the foreman who had been vilified for 50 years as the man who stole the payroll and ran away, was vindicated. The confession letter proved he was the only honest man in a den of thieves, a whistleblower who died trying to protect the evidence. The local historical society erected a small plaque at the trailhead, finally clearing his name. With the remaining fortune, the brothers expanded their operation. They bought a massive 10-acre facility and filled it with state-of-the-art tools. They transformed their YouTube channel from a backyard hobby into a premier heavy machinery preservation foundation. They now travel the world, using their resources to save other iron ghosts, historic machines destined for the scrap heap, bringing them back to life for future generations to see. The D8 now sits in the center of their showroom, the pride of the fleet. On quiet nights, when the shop is empty, Lucas, Caleb, and Wyatt still walk past it, patting the cold steel of the blade. They remember the smell of the pony motor smoke, the shaking of the ground, and the moment the earth opened up to change their lives. They bought a bulldozer for scrap price, but they ended up buying a legacy. They proved that sometimes the rust is just a wrapper for a fortune, and the past is always waiting for someone brave enough to dig it up. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey. If you enjoyed the ride, make sure you're subscribed, because the next rescue is already beginning, and you won't want to miss what we find next.